Thank you, Cindy. And it's a pleasure to be here. I wish we were in person. I could meet all you guys in person, but I appreciate the opportunity to come back to virtually to Race to the Sky. It was always fun to visit you guys in Montana. I'll share my screen quickly here. So I've got some slides I wanted to show you guys. Let's see here. Can you guys see that okay?
Yep,
Cindy,
looks great.
Okay, great. So I talked to Cindy a little bit about, what would you guys want to hear? And I know sometimes nutritional talks can be like watching paint dry. So I wanted to kind of take it past the basic part. Obviously, nutrition is a really important part of performance, and I'm pretty biased because I'm a nutritionist. But I also feel like there are a lot of things that we can do once we have a really good basic nutritional program. There are a lot of things we can do that really help give our dogs an advantage to really optimize their performance, right? We're never trying to push them past what they can do, but it'd be sure nice to help them do what they're capable of doing. So that's what we're going to talk about today. What can you do beyond a basic nutrition? But I want to start with, and this is Roxy Wright, who was one of my great mentors in dog mushing. And actually in 2017, she took my team after I retired and won the Fur Rendezvous in the Open North American at 66 years old as a great grandma. She's the oldest person to win either race and still the only woman to have won the Rendezvous. She's an amazing person, and just was honored in downtown Anchorage as one of the legends of mushing in the mushing corridor on 4th Avenue. So what we're going to talk about today are some general guidelines for performance diets, common dietary mistakes, and then some things that we can do to really fine tune and optimize a program, things that help with GI health, that help with recovery, and things like that. So I just want to let you know a little bit about my background. All the stuff I'm going to show you tonight isn't just opinion. It's stuff that we've learned through research, doing field research with sled dogs, putting them on treadmills, and actually even in some cases, measuring their VO2 max and their expired gases so we can tell exactly what type of fuel they're burning at different exercise intensities. And of course, we then try to take what we learned in the laboratory and apply it in the field. And this is our team racing in the Open World Championship, the Fur Rendezvous in Anchorage. Okay, so for performance diets, I think let's see if I can get rid of this. Hopefully, I don't know. Hopefully you guys can see that okay. For performance diets, what I like to do is feed the first 1,500 to 2,500 calories in a good quality performance dry food. That way, you're going to get all the vitamins and minerals you need. You're going to get some carbohydrates, so you're going to have good quality fats, good quality protein, and then supply the remaining calories in meat and fat. So targeting 40 to 60% of the calories in fat, 24 to 36 in protein, and 5 to 15 in carbohydrates. Those types of diets work really well for any type of sled dog performance. And, that high-fat diet is so important for restructuring the muscles so that they put more mitochondria in there and they can actually get more efficient at burning fat. And then, as we add supplements, one thing I would caution you is know how every supplement works, not just how it affects the balance of the diet for sure, but how do they interact with each other? And are they worth the money that you're putting into them? And the ones we're going to talk about today, I feel definitely are. So this was my basic diet, 5 kilograms. I put this in kilograms because I often give this talk in Europe. 5 kilograms of dry food, 15 kilograms of ground beef, and 5 of tripe, 330 grams of bone meal, 1.5 kilograms of impact, 750 milliliters of a mixed oil, and that's a little bit of fish oil with corn oil and chicken fat, 75 grams of psyllium, and 100 grams of egg powder. We'll talk about that egg powder later, and 30 grams of H. pluvialis, which is a blue-green algae, which is a great source of this antioxidant astaxanthin, which is the very best antioxidant I've ever seen. I mean, I've studied hundreds of them over 30 years of doing this research. This is the only one I could actually see a difference in the dogs, not just in lab values, but actually in the dogs themselves. So common problems, let's start with that. Feeding meat without adding bones. Particularly, if you're grounding up whole chickens, that's fine. But if you're feeding stuff like ground beef, it's really high in phosphorus and has no calcium in it. And because of that, if we do that for too long a period of time, the dog's body is going to want to make sure that it has all the calcium that it needs. It really regulates calcium tightly in the bloodstream. And so it's going to pull calcium from the bone to balance this out. And over time, it's going to cause the bones to be weakened. And where we see this, especially, are fractures in the metacarpal or that part of your palm that is the palm of the dog's hand, and also like the flat part of their foot. So the metacarpal and metatarsal bones. And that's often the very first thing you'll see with this problem. So to prevent that, for every 10 kilograms or say 22 pounds of meat, add 170 grams of bone meal or 70 grams of calcium carbonate and 70 of dical. And I will leave this slide presentation with Cindy so that you guys can go back and look at this. You don't have to memorize it now. The point is, you want to make sure that if you're feeding ground beef, ground horse, any ground meat that doesn't have bones in it, you need to add some calcium back. I see this problem all the time. The next one is over supplementing fat. Fat is great, but like anything else, too much of it isn't great. And if you're supplementing more than 60% of the calories, what happens is you actually displace some of the other nutrients, particularly protein. You can do that for short times, like during the course of an Iditarod or a shorter mid-distance race. But if you train on that, what happens is, because you're displacing protein, you end up with anemia, poor appetite, and poor performance. The good news is you can reverse that by just increasing the protein and decreasing the fat. And usually in 1 to 3 weeks, everything comes back. I've seen this several times, particularly in Iditarod dogs, where people just keep adding more and more fat and don't look at the overall balance of the diet. This is one I see all the time here in Alaska. I don't know how common this is in the lower 48, but we have really great access to fish oil up here because of the fishing industry. And so a lot of times people will supplement fish oil as a fat, and it's actually a great supplement for omega-3s. But you got to be really careful that you preserve it well, that you keep it away from light, heat, and air, and don't keep it over more than one season. The problem with fish oils are that they are highly unsaturated, which means they have a lot of double bonds, which means they're really susceptible to going rancid. And what they will do if you feed that type of fat to your dogs, if it has gone rancid, it can deplete the antioxidants inside the dog's body. And then when the dog starts exercising and generating lots of free radicals through oxygen metabolism, it's going to damage their muscles. And in some cases, I've seen dogs that actually passed away from this. Their muscles will look like they've been steamed. They'll actually be white. So it's a big problem. And so this type of damage can take a long time to repair. If a dog experiences this, usually it'll be hard for them to come back during that season. So the key here is to feed well-preserved, fresh fat that is minimally processed. Remember, heat, light, and air are the things that damage it. And then feed with it an antioxidant, and the one we use most commonly is vitamin E, 200 to 400 IUs, and a lot of races are now requiring people feed that with their diet. And then if this actually does happen to your dog team, you've got to decrease the workload until they resolve the problem, or you're going to cause pretty serious damage to their muscles. I'm going to skip the magnesium one because that's fairly uncommon, and let's move on and start talking about some of the supplements that we can use that'll really benefit performance. And this is a picture from Finger Lake during the Iditarod. And what I want to talk to you about is post-exercise carbohydrate supplementation. So, for most of our sled dogs, our key strategy from a nutritional point of view is to get them really good at optimizing burning fat. Fat has 2.5 times as many calories per gram as protein or carbohydrates. Every protein molecule in a dog's body is doing something, so we'd rather not use them for energy. And the problem is on the human side, we look at carbohydrate loading, and you've probably heard about that. And that was actually discovered by a fellow named Bergstrom, who's a Swedish exercise physiology. He found that feeding high carbohydrate diets with training increased resting stores of carbohydrates, or glycogen. That's what we call that, resting store of carbohydrate. And that increased these resting store of glycogen was highly correlated with improved endurance performance in human marathon runners. So that's where the whole idea of, hey, let's eat a high carbohydrate diet before we go out and run a marathon. We'll load our muscles up with glycogen and they'll do great. That's great for people. But the problem is, if you do that in dogs, feeding that high carbohydrate diet actually impairs their ability to use fat as a main source of energy. And dogs, even a thin, really fit sled dog, has about 50 times as much energy stored in fat as they do in glycogen. So if we can rely mostly on fat and then just use the glycogen for real intense stuff like hill climbing, they're going to go a lot further. Still, as they're exercising, they are going to deplete their glycogen stores. And the longer they exercise, the more they're going to deplete them. And David Costell at Ball State did a really elegant exercise or study with endurance runners. And he had them run 16 miles a day on a treadmill for 3 days in a row. The red bars here are the pre-exercise glycogen or stored carbohydrate levels in their muscle. And the yellow are the post-exercise. And you can see there's a pretty good decline from pre to post-exercise on day 1. On day 2, they didn't quite replete all the way they were to where they started on day 1, and they declined again. By day 3, they're actually starting exercise with less muscle glycogen than they ended day 1 with. And those athletes had a tough time finishing day 3. It was much harder for them. They couldn't maintain the same speed. So they weren't repleting. That's a very important energy source. And then 5 days later, eating a high carbohydrate diet, they still hadn't repleted back to where they were day 1. So how do we replace this source between bouts of exercise? Well, the way we like to do it is to give the dogs some carbohydrates immediately after exercise. And let me talk about that for a minute. When you or your dog exercise, your body takes glucose transporters that are inside the muscle cell and puts them on the surface. So the dog is really good at taking sugar or glucose out of the bloodstream and getting it into the muscle where it can be used. And those transporters stay on the cell surface for about 30 minutes after exercise. If we can give the dog a good dose of carbohydrates right after exercise, they are primed to load those carbohydrates back into the muscle. But that window closes at about 30 minutes post-exercise. So the timing is really important here, and so is the type of carbohydrates. We don't want to use just straight sugar. You don't want to use table sugar. You want to use, the best thing I've found is maltodextrin. Maltodextrin is a digested cornstarch that is in carbon or glucose units of about 8 to 12 glucoses hooked together. The nice thing about that is when you put that in water and give it to a dog immediately after exercise, because it's a polymer, it's a bunch of glucose molecules put together, it doesn't take as much water to process as it would if they were all individual sugar molecules, which could then make the dog sick to their stomach because it would actually be pulling water from its body into its stomach. So it helps that way. It also doesn't cause quite as large of an insulin surge. And that's really good because if we gave this much carbohydrates, we're looking at 1.5 to 2 grams per kilogram body weight. Or for a normal sled dog, someplace around 40 to 50 grams of carbohydrates. What would happen is we would get a big insulin surge, and then they would absorb all that glucose into their muscles, but the insulin would still be high, and they'd actually end up with hypoglycemia or low blood sugar. But by giving it as a polymer, we eliminate that problem. Now let's look at this graph. These were dogs that were exercised identically. They were run 16 miles, and then half the dogs in the purple bars were given 2 grams of maltodextrin in a little bit of water immediately after exercise. The dogs in the yellow bar were given just that same amount of water. Both groups were fed a normal meal 2 hours after exercise. And then what we did is we took muscle biopsies at 4 hours and 24 hours after exercise and looked at how much they had repleted, so in other words, how much carbohydrate they put back into their muscle based on what was there before exercise. So you can see at 4 hours, the dogs that were given a carbohydrate supplement put back about 50% of what was used. The dogs that were given just water put back about 30%. By 24 hours after exercise, the dogs that had been given the carbohydrate supplement immediately after exercise have replaced basically 90 to 100%. That error bar, you can't say it's different than 100%. Whereas the dogs that had just been given water immediately after exercise only replaced about 50%. I would rather drive the dogs in the purple bar on day 2 of a race than the dogs in the yellow bar. And keep in mind, these dogs were fed their normal meal a couple hours after exercise. So the total caloric intake wasn't really different, but giving that carbohydrate immediately after exercise made a big difference. So there are commercial products that'll do this for you. The key is 1.5 to 2 grams per kilogram body weight immediately after exercise, and certainly within 30 minutes. Okay, so that's post-exercise supplementation. For a sprint musher, that's super important. But I think it's really important for distance mushers too. And it's not the kind of thing like you're not going to probably do it every time you stop. But if you're going to take a 4 to 6 hour rest, it would be worth doing that immediately when you stop and then giving them their meal afterwards. I think it would, especially in certain strategic times during the race, like if you're climbing a lot of hills, or if you're getting close to the finish line and you've got like a long layover before your last leg of a race, this would be a great strategy for getting a little bit extra speed in the dogs as they finish. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is exercise and immune function. I've had a million people ask me this, well, maybe not a million, but probably hundreds, ask me, why do my dogs only get sick during the racing season? You know, you train them up, it's the best dog team you ever had in November and December, and you get to the race and they got kennel cough or they get diarrhea and they just can't perform the way they would normally perform. Why does that happen? Well, one thing, I mean, I think this slide shows it really well. When we go to races, we have a lot of dog teams in pretty close contact with each other, right? So how does exercise affect the immune function? We're going to talk about that a little bit, and what can you do to enhance the immune function during training and racing so maybe your dogs won't get sick. Well, we know that there are high rates of infections in athletes where large numbers gather from outside of one area, whether it's across the state, across the country, or across the world, because they're bringing novel pathogens in, right? Pathogens that your dogs haven't been exposed to. I mean, this happens here in Alaska. I'll go down to Anchorage for the first series of races. I live in Fairbanks, and we always come back with a bug after we've been down to that first race, because the things that aren't causing disease in dogs down there that they're just carrying around in their belly are new to my dogs, and they get diarrhea. High training load can do it too. I always found that the hardest time in terms of keeping weight on a dog and is November here, because the dogs are growing a new coat, we're packing on the miles, and it's starting to get really cold. So they have those three stresses on top of them all at the same time. Then, of course, there's the stress of travel, right? I mean, it is stressful for the dogs. We're changing their eating and drinking schedules. They're moving around a lot, and they're getting exposed to these new novel pathogens. So all those combine to make the dogs more susceptible to getting an infection, whether it's a respiratory tract or GI tract infection. So this graph kind of gives you an idea of what I mean by that. The blue line is immune function, and the red line is the risk of infection. And as we do moderate to medium levels of exercise, we actually improve immune function, right? It gets better, and we decrease the risk of infection. But there's a breaking point where exercising or not giving enough rest between bouts of exercise, if it continues to increase, it decreases immune function and it increases the risk of infection. And when we get to this crossover, the dogs are likely to get sick. So we want to try to move this crossover over here to the right, so that even during racing, hopefully your dogs won't get sick. And so how do we do that? Well, there's several different strategies. I want to go through three of the ones that I've used really successfully over a 30-year career dog mushing. Probiotics, I'm sure you guys have all heard of them, but just to define what a probiotic is, it's a viable organism, in other words, a live organism, usually a bacteria, but it could be a yeast or a fungus, that when ingested will transiently become part of the gut microflora and will exert beneficial effects. And that's important because almost none of the probiotics we give are going to live forever in the dog's gut. But I kind of look at them as sending in ground troops to straighten things out and make the environment a little less hostile and a little more favorable for the dog and its immune function, so that it stays healthy. So there's several different species that have been studied. The most common are Lactobacilli acidophilus, Bifidobacter, and Strep faecalis. Couple really key things here. The dose is very important. I think you need 1 billion or 10 to the 9 colony forming units or bacteria per dog per day. A lot of the products you see on the market have 1 million. And I think that's 1,000 times too few to really have an impact. Remember, you're going into a gut that is just laden with billions and trillions of bacteria. To have an effect, you've got to have numbers. And then there's the question of, are the probiotics actually still alive? They're supposed to put on the label how long after the product is released that the probiotics are actually viable. But most of the ones that people, like if you were to go to the store and then try to culture and grow those probiotics, you'll find that a lot of them aren't alive anymore. Certain companies will guarantee it, and you can count it on those probably being viable. But there's a question, some strains may work, or at least work a little bit, even when they're not alive, because of the proteins on the outside of the bacteria affect or enhance immune function. It's better if they're alive. So we did a study a few years back where we realized that diarrhea is common in Alaskan sled dogs, and that probiotics seem to be helpful in reducing stress diarrhea in other species. So can it shorten the duration of stress diarrhea, the kind we see when we go to races with dogs? So the one we used was one that was made by Purina at that time, and I think it's still available. It's called Fortiflora as a brand, but it's a Strep ficalis or SF68 is the actual strain. And we wanted to see if, when the dog broke with diarrhea, if we started treating it with this or a placebo, if there would be any difference in how quickly they resolved. So we enlisted a whole bunch of kennels here in the Fairbanks area. And as soon as the dogs had diarrhea, the owners gave them one of two treatments. They were blinded to the treatment, so they didn't know whether it was a probiotic or a placebo. And they gave it twice a day for 7 days. And we asked them to do a fecal score, where 1 would be liquid stool, 2 would be soft, not normal, and 3 would be firmer, normal stool. And so this is what we found. In the probiotic group, you can see on the bottom, it's the days of treatment, right? 1 through 7. Green, of course, is very watery stool. Red is soft, and black is normal. In the probiotic group, by day 4, most of the dogs had resolved, and they stayed resolved. In the placebo group, they started to improve by day 4, but they didn't completely resolve, and a lot of them by day 7 were actually starting to recur again. So we definitely saw an improvement in the probiotic group. They got better faster, and particularly the really watery diarrhea, the green part of the bar, resolved faster. And, you know, 1 day of not having to pick up watery diarrhea for a dog musher who's got a whole bunch of dogs in the kennel is a big deal. It's a big deal for somebody who has 1 dog on a white carpet at home too, but it's a big deal. And the fact that they stayed resolved, I think, was a big deal. So again, the average days with diarrhea differed in treatment group from 4 in the placebo to 2.5 in the probiotic group, and the average days with watery diarrhea were 2.5 in the placebo group and just under 1 in the probiotic group. So we really did feel like there was a pretty big advantage to using probiotics when they broke with diarrhea. And the thing I like about using probiotics, you know, you see people use metronidazole or other antibiotics. There's a problem with that. First of all, a lot of these diarrheas are caused by either stress or which causes a disturbance in the microflora, or they might be caused by viruses, right? And antibiotics don't work against that. And every time you treat a dog with an antibiotic, you disturb their microflora, and it's a race to repopulate. And the good guys don't always win. Whereas if you use probiotics, that's, like I said, it's like sending in ground troops that establish martial law, right? They kind of get rid of the bad guys and help promote the growth of the good guys. And then they eventually go away themselves, but they've established a favorable environment and restabilize the gut. So in this study, we definitely saw an improvement within 2 days and complete resolution in 4 or 5 days. And that was at least 2 fewer days and often longer than that than we saw with the placebo. So that's probiotics. Now I want to talk a little bit about immunobiologics. That's a big word. What it means is giving the dog something that helps their immune system function better. And actually probiotics will do that. The two I want to talk about are an egg biologic, where they take chickens and they actually vaccinate them against some of the more common pathogens that we see, like Salmonella, E. coli, Clostridium, rotavirus, parvovirus, and even the bacteria and viruses that are responsible for kennel cough. And what happens is then the chickens lay eggs that have billions of IgY, which is a antibody, not antibiotic, but antibody that chickens make. So it's not the same antibody that we see in our bodies, which are like IgG and IgA and IgM, but it doesn't get absorbed. So it's not like you feed this to the dog and then your dog absorbs these antibodies and they have protection. But what it does is it stimulates the immune cells in the gut to be on a higher alert and to secrete IgA. And IgA is the antibody that lines all the mucosal surfaces of the body, so the respiratory tract, the GI tract, and it basically prohibits bad bacteria and viruses from adhering to the mucosal surface and replicating and causing an infection. So it's super effective this way. And you know, I think it's kind of interesting, and in case you guys weren't aware of this, about 80% of all the immune cells in the body are in the gut. Right. So if we put this stuff in the gut, it puts these guys at a higher level of awareness of what's going on. and they communicate with all the other immune cells in the body through the bloodstream. So even though you're giving it in the gut, it's going to work in the respiratory tract, it's going to work in the urogenital tract, and it's going to work across the body. And I'll show you some evidence for that in just a minute. Colostrum is another thing we use in the same manner. And colostrum, for those of you who aren't aware, is the first milk that a mother makes. And it's full of antibodies and other immune stimulants. And so we're using bovine or cow colostrum here. And let me just show you the results of some of the studies. So this is using the egg product from chickens that were vaccinated, the effect on fecal pH. And you can see that the control group is orange and the treatment group is blue, and the pH is significantly lower in the blue group. Lowering the pH makes a more favorable environment for lactobacilli. Remember Lactobacillus acidophilus, one of our probiotics, Enterococci, another probiotic, Bifidobacter, another probiotic, and it decreases the the favorability of the environment for E. coli and Salmonella and Campylobacter and Clostridia, the ones that we don't want there that can make the dog sick. So we're changing the environment of the gut to make it healthier and promote the growth of good bacteria. It also stabilizes the bacteria. These are actually gels that have been from stool samples where we extracted bacterial DNA, and then we ran them on these gels, and each band basically represents a different species of bacteria. Okay. Now the dog on top was a control dog. And what we did is we took these dogs out. We took samples a day before exercise, right before exercise, immediately after exercise, and a day after. And one group was being treated with the egg product, and another group was just given a placebo. And we were blinded to the treatment, right? And then, so we took these samples and we ran these gels. And what you can see, what we're looking for is stability. We want these bands to stay the same over time, because that means that the bacterial populations aren't shifting in the gut, which generally leads to diarrhea. And you can see that the dogs that were treated, the bands are almost identical across all 4 time periods. Whereas the dogs that were on the treatment group, I'm sorry, the control group, there's a lot of variability. There's some dark bands that aren't even there in other places. And there are some bands that are very strongly there at the beginning that disappear. So that's not a good thing. So if we look, we can actually do statistics on this, and the control group had significantly less band stability, or basically the DNA of the populations of bacteria were much more stable in the group that was treated with the egg biologic or the egg powder. So now I want to talk a little bit about colostrum. Remember I talked to you a little bit a moment ago about IgA. It's an antibody that's secreted by the immune cells in the gut. It helps line the gut and protect against infection. What we did is we took 2 groups of dogs, and we started in July, and we took fecal samples monthly. And we looked at the amount of IgA in their stool, right? Which gives us an idea of how much is being secreted in the gut. Higher is generally better. It means you're more protected against infections, okay? The kind of turquoise line represents the dogs that were treated with colostrum. The pink line represents control group. And I think this is really interesting because, okay, we're in July, we're not doing a whole lot of work. We ran our dogs on an exercise wheel, but, they're not training hard. And as we go through the training season, we see that both the treatment and control group increase in their IgA till we get to about November, right? Remember how I told you, like here in November, things start getting tough. It's cold, packing on the miles, growing a new coat. The dogs that were on the control group, their IgAs dropped tremendously after November, whereas the dogs that were in the colostrum treated group, it continued to rise through the whole racing season. Look at the difference between that band that's turquoise colored versus the pink one, from November on. The dogs in the pink line are much more likely to get sick. Now, here's another interesting thing. And remember, I told you how those immune cells in the gut communicate with ones in the rest of the body. We gave our dogs a vaccine in July for distemper. Actually, we did the 5-way: distemper, parvo, parainfluenza. The 5-way one that everybody gives. So we measured antibodies against distemper. So how did they respond? So we gave them a vaccine in July, and you can see that by September we had really good titers against canine distemper virus. But after September, the dogs that were not given colostrum, their titers dropped below the pre-vaccination levels in July and stayed low. Whereas the dogs that were given the colostrum, their titers stayed at post-vaccination levels all the way through the racing season. That means their immune system is functioning way better and they're much less likely to get sick. So even though we're not giving the colostrum intravenously, the dogs aren't absorbing the antibodies from the colostrum. The colostrum is stimulating their immune system to be more ready to fight infection. And I can tell you just from my experience, like when I use both the colostrum and the egg powder, for 7 years, the last 7 years that I raced, I never had to remove a dog from training or racing because of an illness. And, you know, for the egg powder, it's kind of expensive. It costs about $1,000 a year for me to treat my race team. That stuff, I would only give it to the race team. The other dogs in the kennel got kennel cough. They got diarrhea, but the dogs in the race team never did. And they might be even tied next to a dog that wasn't getting it and got sick. So I really believe in this stuff in terms of preventing disease when you're racing. So we've talked a little bit about, you know, post-exercise supplementation. We've talked with carbohydrates to help recover. We've talked a little bit about how to improve immune function with egg, biologic, and colostrum. And now what I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about antioxidants. You know, I'm sure you guys are all familiar with what antioxidants are. They're basically organic compounds. You know, we think of vitamin E and vitamin C a lot as kind of like the hallmarks of antioxidants. Vitamin C works in the liquid part of the cell. Vitamin E works in the cell membrane, which is more fat-oriented or lipid-oriented. And they all have some kind of ring. You can see the structure here. I certainly don't expect you to memorize this. But I mean, they all have a ring structure. And what that ring does is it helps quench free radicals. Free radicals are unpaired electrons that occur when we metabolize oxygen. And the levels of those guys can go up tenfold during exercise. And if we don't have something like an antioxidant on board to quench those, they can rip holes in DNA, in cell proteins and cell membranes and cause a lot of damage to the cells. So we do need to have them on board. And, you know, how do we get them? Well, there's exposure to UV light, oxygen metabolism, inflammation or infection, air pollution. All of those things can cause an increase in free radical damage. So, and exercise, of course, is the one we're going to be most concerned with here. So, you know, vitamin E has been used for a long time. I mean, I remember, oh my gosh, probably 25 years ago when I first started working with Iditarod, we had a lot of problem with, you know, tying up and sudden death in dogs that was due to a condition called rhabdomyolysis, which is when you generate a ton of free radicals and your body can't quench them, and your muscle looks like I mentioned earlier, it looks like it's been cooked. The dogs start off and have a stiff gait, and if we don't recognize it and stop quickly enough, they cause so much damage to their cell membrane that they release contents of their cell, in this case, particularly potassium, in high levels into their bloodstream, and it can cause their heart to stop. So it's a serious problem. We realized this way back in the 80s and started supplementing the dogs with vitamin E, and it really has helped. It hasn't completely eliminated it, but we don't see it nearly as often as we did before. So there's some landmark studies I just want to review with you quickly, just so we understand how these things work and how they don't work. Ken Hinchcliffe, great researcher out of Ohio State, looked at 3 consecutive days of 30-mile runs on dogs. And what he found is that their vitamin E decreased during that time, that there was an increase in this thing called F2 isoprostanes, which is an index of damage done by free radicals. There was an increase in CK or creatine kinase. That's an enzyme that leaks out of the cells when the cell membrane is damaged, usually by free radicals. But no change in their total antioxidant status, or the 2 enzymes that we often use as indicators of antioxidant status that the dogs make themselves, superoxide dismutase or glutathione peroxidase. One of his graduate students then looked at pre-race vitamin E levels at Iditarod, and he found that if dogs had a pre-race vitamin E level at 40 micrograms per mil or higher in their blood, they were 2 times greater chance of them finishing the race. And when they bled the dogs along the race at different checkpoints, if they were able to maintain this 40 micrograms per mil level of vitamin E in their bloodstream, they had a twofold less chance of being withdrawn at any point during the race. So basically, if they start with a high vitamin E level and maintain it, they're likely to finish the race. You could actually pick dogs in the team and say, this dog's likely to finish, this dog isn't. But there was no correlation between vitamin E and speed, so he couldn't pick who was going to win. This graduate student then looked at supplementing vitamin E, vitamin C, and beta-carotene and found that he was able to maintain vitamin E better through the course of the race but couldn't really see any change in measurable indexes of muscle damage. Then they looked at supplementing vitamin E, lutein, and beta carotene, and again maintained a better vitamin E concentration, and this time did see some evidence of decreased DNA damage and protein damage. So what we can see by that is supplementing vitamin E and some of the other antioxidants can help dogs finish the race. So the question is, how much do we supplement and when do we supplement? And interestingly enough, we came across the answer to this, not so much in a study that we had planned to look at it, but just by kind of an inadvertent finding in another study. I had a Danish graduate student staying with me one summer, and he was measuring nitric oxide species in dogs. And nitric oxide is an index of, excuse me, free radical damage, particularly when it comes to exercise. But it can also go up around things like cigarette smoke or forest fire smoke or air pollution and stuff like that. So what he did is, I had a group of dogs that I was exercising on my exercise wheel for 2 hours a day, 4 or 5 days a week. So he would measure those dogs and take a blood sample in the morning and in the afternoon. And then he would measure dogs in the kennel that are not being exercised and at the same time, in the morning and the afternoon. And what he found is that the exercising dogs experienced about a 2-fold increase in nitric oxide species as a result of exercise. So the study was working great. Then one day we had a really bad forest fire come near the kennel, and the smoke was so bad you couldn't even see. It was like fog, right? You couldn't see from our house out to the kennel. So obviously we weren't going to exercise the dogs that day, but I told Andreas, hey, go on out and let's bleed them anyways and see what happens. And this is what happened. So the exercise group there is under the column of exercise. At 7 in the morning, their nitric oxide species were at 2.5 micromolar. That's about what we'd see normally post-exercise. Of course, we didn't exercise them. That was just a result of the forest fires. The control group, so these are dogs.
Arlie, hold on. I think we just lost sound with you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, there we go. I'm sorry. That might have been mine.
Okay. What was the last thing you heard me say, Dylan?
You started talking about the control group there. That's 24.7.
Okay, so in the morning, the exercise group was at about 2.5, which is about what we'd see normally post-exercise. The control group was 24.7, or 10 times higher, okay? By 7 that night, which had smoke still, the exercise group had risen to 8, and the control group had gone to 32. I mean, this is a tremendous difference. So why do you think that's different? They're eating the same diet. The reason it's different is because when we exercise, and when our dogs exercise, they load their muscles with enzymes and natural antioxidants that quench the free radicals that happen during exercise. Those free radicals that happen during training, and I'm not talking about racing now, I'm talking about training. Those free radicals that occur during training as a result of exercise are actually signals that cause the muscles to get bigger, to hypertrophy, that cause us to get a bigger blood volume, to get us more red blood cells. All the advantages we want to see from training happen because these free radicals signal genes to turn on to help us compensate for them better. And those genes also turn on systems that are better at quenching free radicals. So we build this huge capacity to quench free radicals inside the dog's muscle just by exercising them. And that's an important point, because when it comes to supplementing antioxidants, we actually don't want to over supplement during training, because if we do, we will dampen the response to training. We won't get a good result from our training program, and we won't get this buildup of endogenous or in the dog's own muscle antioxidant systems. And those systems are so much more powerful and can handle so many more free radicals than anything we could ever give them orally. So the real strategy here is don't over supplement during training. Then when you get to races, a week or two before racing, when the dogs are already at the peak of fitness, then go ahead and supplement antioxidants. And if you can do it at that time, you're going to get a double benefit. You're going to get the benefit that you got from training and the benefit that you get from giving it to them orally. Okay, the last thing I want to talk to you guys about is hydration. some strategies that we've had that have been really beneficial for us. Water, as you're probably aware, is the single most important nutrient, and yet it's almost always the most overlooked. This is Roland Lombard, and for those of you who don't know who Doc Lombard was, he was a great dog musher and a veterinarian. Grew up in Massachusetts, used to go to Alaska. He had this novel idea that you should water sled dogs. Before he came to Alaska, people in the wintertime said, there's snow on the ground. If they're thirsty, they'll eat it. And he kicked everybody's butt and showed everybody that, hey, they don't get enough water by just eating snow. You have to water. A novel concept in his day, something we all do now. This graph shows you, just gives you an idea of water turnover, the water need per day for, say, a 45-pound to 50-pound sled dog. If that dog is a house dog and it's not really doing anything, the daily requirements are someplace between 12 or 1.5 and 2 quarts or liters. And most of the water loss is in urine. That's the orange part of the bar. A little bit in feces, a little bit in respiratory water loss. If that dog then becomes an open class sprint dog, it about doubles its water needs per day, up to about 3 liters or 3 quarts per day. And you can see the urinary water loss goes up, but the respiratory water loss really goes up. And now if that dog becomes a mid or long distance racing dog, their water requirement goes up 4 or more times from what it was if they were just sitting around the house. And again, there's a little bit of an increase in the urinary water loss, but the largest loss now becomes respiratory loss. The reason for that is, you guys, I'm sure, have seen this on your dogs, and we sure see it up here in Alaska. When a dog breathes in air that's really cold, like below 0 or colder, that air is basically devoid of water, right? Drier than the Sahara Desert. When it hits their lungs, it becomes 100% saturated with water. And then when they exhale it, they're exhaling all that water vapor, and you can see the ice build up on them and on yourselves, during the course of a run. And so we have to make sure that we're replacing this, right? So how do we do that? Well, we can certainly water the dogs. Depending on the type of food we use, we can get some water in that way. And they generate about 10% of what they need every day just by exercising. The process of burning fats and carbohydrates actually generates about 13 mils per 100 calories. So you guys all know about this. These are the different strategies we can use. Baited water, we all do that. You can soak foods and you can feed fish. We have whitefish up here in Alaska that are like 90% water. It's almost like feeding them a fishsicle, and the dogs like chewing on them. Electrolytes are kind of controversial. Dogs don't sweat, and you have to be careful with electrolytes. If you feed too concentrated of a solution, you can actually dehydrate the dogs because it'll pull water from their body into their gut. So if you're going to use electrolytes, I always recommend diluting them to be half as strong as what it says on the label. And then what I want to finish this talk on is to talk to you a little bit about glycerol. This is something we've used for several years, and it works incredibly well. Glycerol is a 3-carbon alcohol. It's actually a normal component of fat. If you heard of fats, they're called triglycerides. That's 3 fatty acids on a glycerol backbone. It's a sweet, sticky, clear, odorless fluid. The cool thing about glycerol is because it's an alcohol, it freely crosses every membrane in the body. So cell membranes are fatty, and so they don't let water through. Things that have water in them have to go through pores, so it's very highly regulated through a transport system. And if fat can get in the membrane, but the inside of the cell is water, and it can't move through that unless it gets coated with a protein. So glycerol is an unusual molecule that it can move both through fat and water, and it brings water with it. So everywhere it goes, it carries water molecules with it. So what we have done is use a 1% glycerol solution. So we gave a liter or a quart of glycerol once a day to a group of sled dogs. We were working with Rick Swenson's team in the study that I'm talking about now, but I've done this thousands of times since then in our own dogs. So 1 liter of a 1% solution once a day in the morning. Then the dogs went out and ran 30 miles at -30 Fahrenheit 3 days in a row. They were given normal watering after the run and normal water with their food in the evening. And the control group was given the same amount of water without the glycerol. And we use a stomach tube to administer it, so we know exactly how much water they got. What we found after those 3 days, that the glycerol-treated dogs had no change in their total body water. Their hydration stayed exactly the same on day 3 as it was before they started running on day 1. The group that was given the same volume of water, but just without glycerol in the morning, we're 5% dehydrated after the third day. 5% is significant. It's clinically significant, and it would definitely impair their performance. So there's a couple different strategies. You can use a loading dose where you put 30 cc's of glycerol in a liter of water and do it the night before, and then each morning use 1%, or you can just use 1% in the morning. The key is to try to give it 3 to 4 hours before a competition, if you can, and then water them like you would for the rest of the day. When we do this, what we find is that the dogs are better hydrated, and they'll maintain, particularly if it's very warm or very cold. Those are the times when it's hardest to keep hydration. The really interesting thing is when it's warm out, if you do this, they will have a lower exercising body temperature by between 2 and 3 degrees Fahrenheit, which is really significant. They'll also eat better because they're hydrated better, and they'll recover better. So for all of those reasons, we have found that this works extremely well. And I did it before every one of my big races. And it's not doping. This is a normal component of the dog's body. We're just giving it strategically. Now, there are a couple caveats, right? You don't want to give it straight without water, and you don't want to give it in more than 3% level. I usually use 1%. Otherwise, you could get some cramping. So with that, I'm going to quit and just see if you guys have any questions. I'll stop sharing my screen. And Cindy, I'll let you moderate that if that's okay. Are you guys still there?
Yes.
Okay.
I think people, can you hear me, Arlie?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I assume everybody can. Okay, so there were a few questions that came up, plus I'll add a few. To all the participants, feel free to put more in the chat. There were a couple questions about using the maltodextrin or the brand name glycocharge. One person said that she had trouble getting her dogs to drink the water when that maltodextrin was added. She thought it wasn't very palatable. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, there's a couple things you can do that help with that. We've had issues with that too. Just certain dogs don't like it. And some of them, my dogs, for whatever reason, don't always want to drink right after exercise, right? So what we have done is to take, glycocharge or whatever product you're going to use, mix it up in a bucket. So figure out how much you need for all the dogs that you're going to treat, right? Mix it up in a bucket. Put a little bit of canned tuna fish cat food in there because they like it for whatever reason. And put 3 or 4 packets of Knox gelatin in there. Mix it up so that it's barely consistent, a consistency that you can just pour, right? So it's not like glue, but it's not super watery either. It's like almost like a oatmeal or a heavy porridge type consistency. And then take a bunch of ice cube trays, spray them with Pam, pour them in the ice cube trays, and then divide the number of ice cubes that you make by the number of dogs that you'd have to treat, because you started with how much you were going to need for all of your dogs, right? In our case, that usually ended up being about 4 ice cubes per dog. And then, freeze those up. And then when it's time to, right after the race, you can pop them out and just give them to the dogs. And they'll often be the consistency of like a fudgesicle. And for whatever reason, the dogs really like it. They really like it. And you can add, if there are other things that you have that the dogs really like for flavoring, like somebody just talked about Vom here, that's tripe, powdered tripe, you can use that. There are things like that you kind of have to play with it. And I had one dog in particular that was a pain in the neck. I had to make special cubes just for her because it's the only thing that she would, we found a recipe that was the only thing she could eat. She was worth it. She never missed the heat of a race, but she was a pain in the neck. So those are the things that I try to do when the dogs won't. And the thing is, you don't have to do this after every training run. In fact, you don't want to. Do it on the last training run before a race, and then between heats of a race, or when you're resting for longer than 4 hours.
Okay, let's see. Someone asked about the specific dose of the maltodextrin or glycocharge, and I think you did say, I think that was
the maltodextrin itself, because glycocharge has got other things in it, right? But and I think it comes with a scoop that tells you this much per dog. And I actually designed in that product like 30 years ago. Okay, so That one is pretty easy to figure out. But if you're making it yourself, you want 1.5 to 2 grams, and I like to go to the 2 grams per kilogram body weight, or a gram per pound of body weight. And that will be plenty to replenish what you use between bouts of exercise.
And that's the amount of glycocharge?
That's the amount of maltodextrin.
Oh, okay.
So glycocharge has some other things in it too. It's got some powdered liver, and it's got some vitamins and stuff, so that you'll give a little bit more of that. But it comes with a scoop that's good for like either 1 dog or 4 dogs.
Okay. Then there was a question about the dosage per dog of vitamin E.
400 milligrams is what I use. And a milligram is the same as an IU for vitamin E. Not for every vitamin, but for vitamin E. So.
And you commented that perhaps it was more important to use that during competition than during training.
Yeah, I mean, once you get your dogs to the peak of fitness, right? When you've finished your long runs and you're just into racing, then start using those. And if you're going to do super long runs, then you might want to use it during a super, or like the day before and during a super long run. Anytime you put the dogs in a situation where they're exercising significantly more than what they're used to, or their amount of rest between bouts of exercise is going to be significantly less. And I'm not just talking about normal bump ups in mileage that we do in training, but if you're going to, like, I know people here will say, oh, I'm going to go out and put a 100-miler on them this weekend. Obviously they haven't put a 100-miler on them yet. And so with that in mind, be a little bit kind and use it the day before, during, and after for something like that. But you don't want to do it during training. Most of your diets are going to have plenty of vitamin E in them to cover what happens in training. And you don't want to dampen that response that's going to put antioxidants in the dog's muscle and help them and do all the adaptations that we want for training to get them in better shape. There's a lot of good data on humans and dogs and rats that show that if you supplement antioxidants heavily during training, you won't get in as good a shape.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, question about where to purchase some of the supplements. Like if online or where to purchase.
Yeah, almost all of these are available online. The antioxidant I like to use that I think works the best, I'd say it's 50 times better than vitamin E, is astaxanthin. And you can buy that online in either a powder or as a pill. And the dose I'd like to use is 4 milligrams per dog per day. That is an incredible antioxidant. Like I said, it's the only one I've ever seen where not only do you see a difference in the lab work, but you could see a difference in how fast the dogs recover.
Now, would you repeat the dose again?
4 milligrams per dog per day.
Okay.
And again, not until they're fit. So I don't start using that till like December, January.
And is there a particular probiotic product that you?
So there's a lot of good ones. And actually, thanks for asking that question. One thing I forgot to say about probiotics, be careful with multiple products that have multiple probiotics in them. Probiotics are really interesting in that one is great, but when you put a bunch of them together, they can actually work against each other and nullify the effects. So I prefer to go with single species, make sure you have 1 billion of them in there. And, I think any of the Lactobacillus acidophilus are great. The Streptococcus fortiflora is great. That's the one I've had the most experience with, and it has worked extremely well. Bifidobacter species are also good. Those are the 3 that have the most data on them. And, the thing I always want to go with on probiotics is there peer-reviewed data, which the stuff I showed you today we've published that. Is there peer-reviewed data that shows that there's actually a benefit, right? That's one question. The other one is, are they live? Are they going to guarantee that they're live? And are there enough of them? Are there 1 billion of them per dog per day?
And what glycerol product would you recommend?
So glycerol is, it's also the other name for that is glycerin. There's a couple things I'd look out for there. It's used a lot in pharmacies, right? So, but a lot of times when you buy it from a pharmacy, it's scented. You don't want that. Where I like to buy it from is like farm stores, because they use it in the livestock industry too. You can get a gallon of this stuff for like $20, and a gallon of it will last a long, long time, and it doesn't go bad. So that's where I like to get it. So I've gotten it from like Butler and different distribution places like that, and from farm stores, places like that. You can get it online.
Let's see, looking for other questions here. I think I might have missed a couple. Someone says they feed only meat, like Vom from Norway. That's the tripe, I guess.
Yeah.
They're asking if they should add some sort of kibble or other
Absolutely.
carbohydrates.
No, I mean, Vom is great stuff, but it is not balanced. It doesn't have enough calcium in it. It's got some vitamins, but it doesn't have all the vitamins balanced. I think Vom is the protein in there is fantastic in terms of the essential amino acids, branch chain amino acids. It's got some great stuff in it, but it's not meant to be the only thing you feed. I would feed a really good commercial diet, the best you can afford. Again, start your first 1,500 to 2,500 calories in that. And then if you're going to use Vom as your meat, use it. It's a great meat. I've used it myself. It's fantastic. But I would never use it just by itself. And if you use a lot of it, you are going to have to balance out what you use with some calcium, either bone meal or calcium carbonate.
And do you need to assume that dry foods don't have enough calcium in?
No, dry food has enough calcium for itself, but when
Okay,
you're adding 20 pounds or 30 pounds of meat, there's almost no calcium in that at all. And
yes.
there's a ton of phosphorus, and it's not just the amount of calcium, it's the calcium phosphorus ratio. If you or a dog's body detects that you've taken in more calcium, you want a calcium to phosphorus ratio of about 1.5 to 2 calciums per phosphorus. If that gets reversed, no matter how much calcium you're taking in already, you might be meeting the daily minimum requirement, but because you're taking in so much more phosphorus, you'll start leaching calcium from your bones. Your body will start taking it from your bones.
Another question on probiotics. Should they be given throughout the training season?
And if you can afford to do that, that's a great thing to do, because it will help keep the microflora stable, and it will help prevent infections. We did some studies with Fortiflora and showed that we got a pretty similar increase in IgA that I showed you with colostrum. So it is great stuff. The problem is it's expensive, right? So I would use it like a week before races and through the race and a week after. And I would always use it if a dog ever got sick. By the time we got done racing, I never used antibiotics ever to treat diarrhea in the kennel. I always treated it with probiotic and was very successful with that. And, we did have some diarrhea in the kennel because we didn't give everybody the egg powder or the colostrum, because that is a bit expensive. We just gave that to the race team.
Someone said they've had trouble finding some of the supplements in bulk, and just asked if there are safe ones, if the livestock versions are safe. I guess you addressed that with the glycerol.
Yeah, with glycerol, that's for sure true. Colostrum, you can buy that in bulk, and I wouldn't use like the human colostrum. You're going to buy like a little tiny 1 pound canister, and it's going to cost a lot. You can buy that in 40 and 50 pound bags from livestock dealers online, or in a farm store, at a feed store. And the egg powder, the place I get it from, and I think is the best source, is Trow Nutrition, TROUW. And it's expensive. I think a 40 or 50 pound, it comes in a barrel of that, is about $1,000, but that'll do my entire race team. The dogs that I would have, about 24 dogs on that team, that'll do the whole team for the whole season. And yeah, that's a lot of money, right? But you get to your main race of the year and your team gets sick. How much money and time have you put into that? And I get no kickback from any of these products, even the glycocharge. I designed it for a friend of mine. I don't get any kickback from Trow. I've just done a bunch of research using that product. And I can tell you that, like I said, for the last 7 years I raced, I never had to take a dog out of training or racing, while other dogs all around them were getting sick. So I feel pretty strongly that stuff works. The caveat is, and this is something you got to know, is it takes you have to give it to the dogs every single day. If you miss one day, they're going to become susceptible. So we had that happen one time when we went away on a race and had a dog that was recovering from an injury, and she didn't get treated while we were gone, and she came down with kennel cough.
And the product is TROUW.
Right. You can look it up on the Trow Nutrition. You look it up on the internet, and they have several different products, but they have one that's specifically for this purpose.
Okay. Let's see. We're probably running out of time, but maybe one more question. I think somebody had a general question about water. How much water would you give post-exercise with a maltodextrin, and how much in general in a day?
That's a great question. I'm a sprint musher, so I probably give a lot less water than you guys do as mid-distance and distance mushers. My dogs would get probably someplace around 2 to 2.5 liters of water a day, spread out from morning to evening, right? And one thing I saw this happen with Rick's team once many years ago. He got on a kick where he was really watering the dogs a lot. You can actually dehydrate your dogs by overwatering them. Because what happens if you overwater, the kidneys work, they filter your entire blood volume many times a day. And they've got this amazing countercurrent exchange mechanism that allows them to concentrate the urine, because if you were to like section a kidney and look at where the little loops of Henle go through, the concentration of salts and other solutes are very, very low at the start of the loop, and they get more and more concentrated as you go down the loop. And so that concentration gradient allows the body to pull more than 97% of the water that it filters every day, or the fluid that it filters every day, back into the body. And that's why you don't dehydrate yourself by filtering your blood so many times. But if you wash out that concentration gradient, you can no longer concentrate your urine, and you can actually dehydrate a dog by doing that. I've seen that happen a couple of times. So rules of thumb, for like sprint type mushing, the type of running that we do, out to 30 to 50 miles a day, probably 2.5 liters is probably sufficient. And that includes the water that you put in the food. And for long distance, it's really variable depending on how far you're going and how cold it is outside or how warm, but up to 6 liters a day, and probably on a daily basis, 3.5 to 4 is a good rule of thumb.
If for distance racing, I feel like dipping snow is a significant part of their fluid intake, although I don't know how to quantify that.
Yeah, you can't really quantify it. And I think for distance racing, that's less of an issue than it is for sprint racing, right? Because in terms of a problem, because you're going a little slower, dogs can do that. They're not running at 95% of VO2 max, so it doesn't make them vomit unless they do a lot of it. Whereas with sprint dogs, if they do too much of that, they will throw up. And it's not good to throw up while you're running, because you can get aspiration pneumonia. And what I've found for sprint dogs, most of the dipping we see isn't actually associated with hydration. It's more associated with stress. The dog's you're going too fast for the dog, or they run too far up the team. And when you change those things, they often will stop dipping. And I see a lot of people punish dogs for dipping, and I think they're making a big mistake. I think that the dog is trying to tell them, hey, I'm stressed. And when you punish them, all you do is add to that stress. I think it's a different deal with distance dogs, and I agree with you, Cindy. It's hard to quantify, but if they are dipping, maybe they need a little bit more water, and try to make that a priority the next time you stop.
Is it reasonable to go by urine color to get a sense?
Absolutely. Urine color is a great way. And, I don't like to see the urine colorless. I think that's a problem. But if it's pale yellow, that's great. If it's dark yellow, they probably need more water. And if it's brown, not only do they need more water, but they've probably caused some muscle damage.
Well, I don't know about you all, but I could ask Arlie questions for another hour, but I think we need to stop.